VMware is a sponsor of our ebook series on Docker and the container ecosystem. Learn more about VMware's perspectives on these timely and important topics in our latest ebook about application architectures and microservices. It's available for download at thenewstack.io. It's Alex Williams with the New Stack here with Kit Colbert, and Kit is a VMware CTO. Kit, why don't you tell us a little about who you are and what you do, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
You bet.
So I run a new team at VMware called Cloud Native Applications, and the focus of that team is really around all these next generation application technologies. So it can be things like containers, or application architectures like microservices, trends like DevOps, continuous integration and development, deployment. And so on and so forth. And really what my team is focused on is a few things, primarily how we help our customers to embrace these technologies. From a product standpoint, we're also looking at both extending existing products as well as building out new products, really focused on the infrastructure side of these next generation applications, the infrastructure enabled to run them.
Mm-hmm. So how do you take your customers along that container journey?
Yeah, that's a good question because, over the past 10, 15 years, VMware has obviously been very focused on the operations space and less so on the developer space. Really what we are focused on is, at first, really driving a reduction of costs, CapEx reduction in the data center by consolidation. But what we found is that by being able to put in this new abstraction layer, we were able to create a platform that allowed operators to basically optimize their data centers so they could put all their many different types of applications on this common platform and have a common operational model there. So that's been our traditional focus. And now, kind of as you point out, what we're seeing is these next generation application architectures happening, a lot of in-house development. So developers are becoming more and more influential in terms of technology buying decisions, right? And so I think, the standard narrative is that, you see kind of a lot of the push for things like Docker, container technologies, et cetera, coming from developers and, lines of business, application teams, and so forth. And that's absolutely what we're seeing. But it is kind of interesting. So there's other cases, though, where we actually are seeing the push from IT ops. Yeah. Interestingly, they're kind of trying to go back to the developers and saying, hey, this is cool new technologies. You guys should check it out.
Why are they wanting to do that?
Well, I think what they see is, again, if you zoom back for a second, I think the impetus behind a lot of this is really how businesses can move faster, right? Mm-hmm. We're seeing this whole, it's this kind of Mark Andreessen's software is eating the world thing, right? It's a few years old now, but it's a very real phenomenon. And, you're seeing companies being transformed by this and how they deliver value to their customers. And so I think as we're seeing more and more things, it's kind of interesting where nowadays, in some sense, it's like the actual product a company makes may be less important than the way a user interfaces with that product. So, what's more important is the experience on the mobile device or the web. So just one quick example from me personally was that we have all these speakers in my house and wired up to the basement, and so I wanted some way to control those speakers from my iPhone. So I researched and found this company called Sonos. They make an amp, you plug it into your network, you get your app on the phone, and you're good to go, right? Works perfectly. Things very smooth. And I was reflecting on this purchase, years ago I bought it, but I was reflecting on this a few months ago, and the thing that I realized is that and I did pretty extensive research looking at, the different streaming services that supported and other things. But the thing I never actually researched was audio quality. So here's a company that defines itself, presumably, Sonos sound, based on the quality of its audio, and yet what I cared about most was the quality of its software, right? The experience, the digital experience that I had. So I think that's what businesses are seeing, and CIOs are recognizing this. Even CEOs are starting to recognize this, that this is a company level issue. That if they don't figure that out, they may well be disrupted by someone who does figure out the digital experience better. So what we're talking. So as we start talking to customers, even on the IT ops side, they're seeing those same sorts of things, realizing they need to move faster, and this is where the discussions for things like Docker and microservices and so forth start to come in. So we're seeing the pushing happening both ways. But I will say certainly that, for many of our customers who have, gone and built out virtualized data centers, or in some cases private clouds, there is still kind of a big jump in order to embrace these next generation applications that, especially with things like DevOps, if you really want to maximize the velocity of the org, how fast you can respond to the market, how fast you can push out product updates, that requires pretty fundamental organizational changes. And so I think that's the thing that people are struggling with. Is it's not just, with virtualization, it was a pretty transparent layer. No one, you went from 8 weeks to 10 weeks to deploy a server down to a few minutes. But the rest of your process and, organizationally, you stayed mostly the same. Mm-hmm. Here we're seeing, in order to truly take advantage of all these opportunities, you have to reorganize, you have to change your culture, you have to think differently. Mm-hmm. So those are the challenges that we're seeing a lot in our customer base, and they're really not sure how to get started, how to drive through these things, so on and so forth.
So what do you need to offer them to help them get through those things? Mm-hmm. You talked about the abstractions a little bit.
So I think it's important to, and I think the abstractions are really important because, as I said before, we really see ourselves as an infrastructure provider, right? And we don't see ourselves being in what you might call the application platform space.
Right.
So my definition, the application platforms would be things like platforms as a service, Cloud Foundry, or any sort of container technologies like Docker Swarm, Kubernetes. These are things I would associate more at the app level. They're more application centric. They know a bit more about the app architecture, and they can do more app level things like application level request routing, mm-hmm. load balancing, high availability, these things. So we kind of sit underneath that. So I think our point of view is really that. Abstractions are very key for developers, and in particular APIs make or break an experience. And what we're seeing is tremendous interest across the board in these different technologies. A lot of customers are very excited about Cloud Foundry and about the really simple out-of-the-box experience there, mm-hmm. right? You buy it and you get everything that you need. But then we also see some customers taking more of a DIY approach. Mm-hmm. Rather than getting something from a single vendor, they're taking Docker as the basis and building on top of that, adding mm-hmm. things like a Kubernetes for scheduling and something for network, something for storage, and so forth, and something for service discovery like console, and kind of building that together themselves. And I think what we're looking at is, we're not trying to make a bet on any one of those application level technologies. Mm-hmm. We really want to be able to support them all. And so our focus in what we're doing is really enabling our infrastructure offerings to better integrate with those various application platform technologies.
So how are you doing that?
Yeah, so what we've announced is two main product offerings, and there'll of course be more, but this is what we've announced to date. They are, the first being vSphere integrated containers, and then Photon platform. Mm-hmm. So vSphere integrated containers is really about how we can enable our customers to extend the infrastructure platform they already have, namely vSphere. Right, it's in pretty much every major data center around the world. A lot of customers, as I said, have really used that as that single infrastructure platform mm-hmm. for running all their apps. And so what happens is that oftentimes the developers come in and they say, "Hey, we're starting to use Docker. We really want to run this stuff in production." And at the conference keynote earlier today, Ben Golub was talking about the increasing amount of Docker that they're seeing in production. But I think one of the challenges there is how do you actually run this thing in production with the same level of same level of capabilities that you have for all your more traditional apps, and that goes to things like monitoring, health monitoring, How do you do performance analysis to make sure that there's no sorts of performance issues? Compliance and security also come up as being big things, and so on and so forth. And so these are things that have largely been solved within the vSphere world. I spent the last 10 or 15 years building out that ecosystem, and it's, of course, continuing to evolve, but it's got a very firm foundation. And so with vSphere integrated containers, what we're doing is allowing companies to apply all the same technologies that they have with vSphere and surrounding vSphere to containers, effectively making containers a first-class citizen on vSphere. And so in that model, anything that you do with VMs, you can now apply to containers. And so that means network, storage technologies, monitoring. We have.
So if you're running VMs and you're currently running VMs, and you want to run containers, take us through that story. How that would work in this example.
Yeah, and I think the reality is you're going to be running a bit of both.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So today you're going to have some process for deploying applications inside of VMs. And there's different ways of doing that. You can do in-place upgrade. You can do template management, VM template management, and so forth. And so you have mechanisms to deploy it and update it. And then once it's out there, then you have all this, as I said, all these tools to monitor and ensure security and so forth. So I think what we see, and customers see as well, is the benefit of containers really helping to drive that build, ship, run process and make that faster, lighter weight, and so forth. So really where we're coming in with vSphere integrated containers is on the run side, and maybe arguably some part of the ship. But basically, on the development side, they can build it. They can go through the continuous integration and deployment cycle, test it, make sure it works. And then effectively what we do is we are integrating in a Docker API into vSphere. And so, within the CI/CD process, if the customer wants, it can be all Docker, right? Docker down to the laptop of the developer to actually do their coding, Docker down to a testing or staging environment to deploy the container for testing, and then Docker as the interface on the production side as well. So what we're doing is effectively running the real Docker engine inside of vSphere, doing it in a way that you get multi-tenant isolation, security, separation, and so forth, and using the Docker interface, you can deploy containers. And so we'll take care of provisioning VMs, backing those containers, and so forth, and do all that great stuff in the background. So the idea is to make it very seamless from a developer point of view. So you don't have to know it's vSphere. They don't have to care, and they shouldn't care. Quite honestly, right? They can put together, or the build and release team can put together a great CI/CD pipeline that could be all Docker, purely Docker interfaces, and have that even in production. But on the back end, it would actually be vSphere. So that means the ops teams can continue to leverage what they already have and apply all the existing operational process that they have, even with these next generation applications inside of containers.
And so then you also have the Photon platform, and that's an alternative to vSphere. It
is. And so this is something that I think may have surprised some people because, at VMware, our focus has obviously been on the data center side anyway. vSphere is kind of the core infrastructure building block. However, as we started looking at the cloud-native application space, at the container space, what we found is that if you start taking it to extremes, or you start focusing on folks who have mature applications, their requirements for infrastructure start changing. Now, you have to understand that vSphere was designed for more traditional applications in the sense that these traditional applications scale up rather than scale out. They're generally not resilient to infrastructure failure, right? If a host goes down, that application will go down, likely. And so what we've been doing within vSphere is really building out a lot of infrastructure availability technologies, trying to work around some of the limitations of these traditional application architectures, right? And that's great. And so, it works both for these traditional apps. It also works just fine for next-gen apps that may or may not need things like vMotion, but it's there in case you need it. Now, as we said, if we're really looking to optimize, though, for cloud-native apps, the infrastructure that you want will have a different set of trade-offs, and that's exactly what we're focusing Photon on. So What we're focusing Photon on here is less about lots of infrastructure capabilities and more about simplicity, ease of use, high scale.
Going back to your Sonos example, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Kind of tailoring it for that experience.
And, making the application, the experience of using the software, something that is simple and appealing.
Yes. Yeah, and part of the design there, by the way, is that we're kind of designing for. I mean, people can use it at any scale, of course, but we're really designing for folks who are running hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of container instances, right? So pretty high-scale environments. And when you start looking at those sorts of environments, what we're seeing is that you can't manage individual VMs or individual containers. It just doesn't scale, right? Running hundreds of thousands of these things. So what people are starting to leverage are these sort of application or container cluster schedulers, things like Cloud Foundry or Kubernetes or many others out there. And so what our focus is really doing is tightly integrating Photon platform with those cluster frameworks. So the idea is we can simplify both provisioning of those things as well as the day two operations on them. Essentially managing clusters as kind of a first-class entity within Photon. So that way you don't provision a VM, you provision a Kubernetes instance or a Cloud Foundry instance. And Photon platform will take care of the VM creation, the networking to stitch those things up, any sort of persistent storage to back them. Each of these clusters can be fully multi-tenant separated, isolated and secured, and so forth. So the idea is that we're effectively offering a self-service platform for developers to go out and provision these things. They get the cluster of their choice. Then they can interact directly with that cluster to provision their application instances.
So by the time we publish this interview, it'll be known that you've open sourced some of this technology.
Yeah. Matter of fact,
that's a big part of it, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Maybe you could then just look, answer that, in context with what is the Photon platform? What it consists of exactly?
Sure.
So people can get an idea of that.
Yeah, it's a good point. So first of all, let me talk about the open source bit because that's something that we're very much committed to, and so with Photon, we're open sourcing today the first part of it called Photon Controller. And so Photon Controller is effectively a new scale-out control plane. So, let me describe both pieces of it. So there's Photon Machine, which is effectively a lighter weight version of ESX. Kind of we stripped out some of the high-level features, kind of the core hypervisors left. We've also included our Linux distro, Photon OS, as part of that. So it's a really simple hypervisor plus Linux distro combination, and it's meant to be a lightweight compute host that you install on your physical machines, right? And so you'll have potentially hundreds or thousands of these physical machines in your environment that make up a Photon platform instance. And so the Photon controller's job is to sit on top of all those Photon machine instances and really provide the control plane functionalities. So that means host management, scheduling, container and VM provisioning, so on and so forth, but doing so in a way that is distributed and highly available. So Photon Controller itself is a cloud-native app, right? You can have multiple instances of this thing deployed across your Photon machine fabric. If individual Photon machines go down, then that's okay. Photon Controller will continue running, even if that takes down some instances of it. The other instances will continue to work just fine, and there's data is replicated in such a way that the thing is highly resilient to infrastructure failure. So the two main pieces are Photon Machine and Photon Controller. As I said, we're open sourcing Photon Controller today. It's live right now. Actually, you can go to GitHub and check it out. It only works with ESX today, but obviously I'm sure it'll take no time at all for someone to build a KVM integration.
Right.
And we encourage that, right? That's the whole point of really open sourcing. We want to build a community around this.
So you're making containers first class. So by logical, and that makes it logical that you would make these clusters first class.
Exactly.
Citizens.
Well, I think it's trying to up-level the abstractions that we're exposing, getting back to the abstraction discussion, right? So at first we virtualized x86 hardware in the context of a virtual machine. And what we're doing with vSphere integrated containers is in some sense virtualizing the container host itself.
Okay.
Virtualizing some
The entire
parts.
host itself.
Yeah, some parts of the Docker host. Now, of course, the Docker engine is still there, but we're kind of virtualizing the host. And here on Photon Platform, we're virtualizing effectively the cluster. So again, it's still Kubernetes or Cloud Foundry or whatever it is under the covers, but we're providing a really simple abstraction for you to go and provision and manage those things on an ongoing basis.
And so, this sets up some interesting kind of scenarios here, so people can start using containers at scale. But there's this complexity too still, so you're abstracting the services, but there's this traditional heterogeneous environments. And how are you helping your customers understand how to manage this container density? Because you can't know everything that's in the infrastructure, and the amount of information that's being generated when you start scaling containers becomes considerable, and there's all kinds of considerations to take into effect. And security being a major one.
Well, I think it's so there's definitely a lot of challenges here, and I think we as an industry are still trying to figure out a bunch of this stuff, right? I mean, you have a bunch of the web scale giants like Google and Twitter, Facebook, etc., who have learned how to run at very high scale, and there's kind of the set of best practice, and Netflix and so forth, the set of best practices they discovered and have, very readily talked about, put a lot of that stuff back as open source. But I think part of what we're trying to do is how do you kind of industrialize that for general uptake by enterprises and companies alike, right? So I think, so again, we kind of view it in two different ways. So part of it is, with vSphere integrated containers, you don't require dramatic process change. So you can run both traditional apps, next-gen apps, side by side, same set of process. So the way you secure traditional apps can more or less be the same. Now, there's probably faster ways of doing it for containers, but if you're just, as a company, getting your feet wet, this might be a good way to get started, right? I think partly what we're trying to offer is some way to have an evolution rather than revolution on this journey, right? And so vSphere integrated containers is absolutely the more evolutionary way of doing it. But we also, of course, offer the revolution path, which is Photon Platform.
Right.
And I think there again, it's going to take, it takes a village, right? So we're going to offer some aspects in terms of infrastructure isolation and security, really hardening that interface. Docker's talking a lot about what they're doing at the registry level and provenance of containers. Who this container come from, can we validate that cryptographically, so on and so forth, right? And we want to integrate tightly with that. We're doing things like our Lightwave component, which does container identity, container authentication, and so forth. And part of what we're doing is working with Docker to integrate with everything they're doing with Notary and content trust and so forth. And so, the example I always use is how can we make data centers more like an iPhone, where like iPhones are very heavily locked down in terms of the apps they run. They're all cryptographically signed. They're all very tightly controlled via Apple's ecosystem. Whereas most data centers today, you kind of have no idea what's running out there. Once you get, if some hacker gets access to Linux, they can exec whatever process they want. So I think we have the opportunity, especially in a Photon Platform type world, where it's more of a greenfield approach, kind of like Apple did with iOS in a greenfield approach, which is that you can set some pretty firm boundaries and requirements around these sorts of security issues. So that's just one example, security. But I think we're very much interested in working with the community and with many companies that have figured it out, like the web scale guys, to, as I said, bring a lot of these learnings to the masses.
So what's the story that you want people to hear about VMware, because in this context, because VMware has had tremendous success in being a virtualization provider, and this is a new form of virtualization at the application level. How are you trying to tell the world this is our approach, and this is and here's who this is important for?
Sure. So Yeah, so I think there's definitely, I think what you're going to see is us kind of evolving as a company as well, right? Our traditional focus has been purely on the operations side, and we've operated, generally speaking, in a closed source model. And so I think what's changing is that open source is becoming kind of the de facto standard for a lot of companies when they're making technology purchasing decisions. And so we absolutely want to continue to stay relevant to our customers and be able to meet them where they are, right? Which means going more developer-oriented, becoming more open source. And by the way, you're seeing similar changes from folks like Microsoft as well. I think there's a number of companies that are kind of on
Cisco.
On this same transition, right? And so I think really what we're talking about is, I think the benefit we can offer to customers is that we've got a lot of experience in running enterprise-grade applications, providing the infrastructure behind those applications. And so now what we're really looking at doing is how to take all those learnings and extend them for these next-generation apps, but at the same time provide the right sorts of interfaces for developers to really help accelerate their development process and the ability to effectively ship and run those out in production.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting times, and and you guys are working quite a bit on that open source aspect of things. I'm curious on how do you help people understand concepts like microservices, for example?
Yeah, sure. So there's a few different ways we're doing that, right? So we do a lot of customer outreach. We have obviously a lot of sales folks, a lot of partners who engage with our customers.
How do you describe microservices to people? I mean, because this is hard to do, because I ask everyone this question, and the answers are very wide ranging.
Yeah. Well, I think I kind of take a step back and I look at it's always a question of why, right? It's like why do this, why do that, why make that decision? Yeah. So what I talked about is a few things. Part of the push toward microservices, just as an example, is scale. Being able to scale up. But I think for most customers, scale is kind of a second order problem because you got to have a popular product to care about scale, right? And so until you get the popular product, it's like, does scale really matter? Not really, right? You can have a perfectly fine monolithic application until you have scale problems, and then you need to rethink.
And scale's relative to everyone.
It is. Right? It is. So I think the more important thing initially is actually agility and being able to rapidly update your products, because a lot of what the whole like lean movement and agile in general is a shift from the waterfall model of waterfall. You kind of assume that you're right? Because you have to. If you're spending 9 months or a year or 2 years putting out something, you better be right. Otherwise, you're making a tremendous risk, tremendous bet and huge risk that you are. Versus agile and lean, which kind of makes the assumption that you're probably wrong. Right. And if you assume that you're mostly wrong, then you change a lot of behavior. You update much more frequently. The update cycles are much quicker, because that way you reduce the risk of any single update. And so a key part of that is getting feedback and continuously getting feedback on those updates that you make. So I think that's, so when I see microservices, I think that's one of the big benefits is how do you take, many times a large software organization, allow them to move faster? Well, in a monolithic world, you got to compile everything together, and it's a big process, and you get everyone in a room, and things break, and it's kind of a mess, right? Whereas in a microservices world, especially in a SaaS type model, because you have well-defined APIs between each of the components, you're able to update very, very quickly. Each team can update whenever they want, so long as they don't break their APIs. They don't need to tell anyone else, right? So the benefit that I see first and foremost for most folks from microservices is agility. And that's actually, why you should do it. Well, because you become faster and better able to react to market demands, and better able to validate that the changes you're making are actually desired and useful for customers, desired by and useful for customers.
And that's a shift towards continuous integration.
It is, yeah. So there's a bunch of other things. It's not just microservice. Like that's the app architecture. Even then, it's not necessarily required, but as you get larger and larger teams, it becomes more and more critical. But yeah, you're right. Continuous integration, continuous deployment, and then more advanced feedback mechanisms, being able to do A/B testing, this sort of stuff. Because it's really a loop that we're talking about here. How do you go from idea to running code in production and then getting feedback on that as quickly as possible? And that's really the cycle that we're talking about. And so that's the real challenge, because, again, this goes back to the earlier part of the discussion, the whole DevOps nature of this, right? That, if you're just still throwing code kind of or compile binaries over the wall between development and operations, and no one knows what's going on, and there's a lot of manual work, it's like, it's just, you're not going to be able to move that fast. And so that's where developers need to start wearing pagers and thinking more operationally. Operations people need to start coding to fill in some of the gaps, and to plug in some of the infrastructure integration into the apps, and so on and so forth. And so it's really taking a more holistic systems view of the problem, which is, again, how do I get from idea to running code in production, and then get feedback on that as quickly as possible. And everyone on the team is effectively responsible for that. Now, they each have their own area that they're accountable for. Someone's going to be operations focused, someone will be writing code for the product as a developer, but their responsibilities don't necessarily end at any fixed point. It's kind of like, what do you need to do to make this successful?
Yeah, and the risk the risk is less, isn't it, when you're experimenting with environments like this? Just because of the lightweight nature of it, you can, with like a Photon platform, I expect you can try things really quickly and see how they work or not.
That's the whole point. Is like, I think
one of the agility, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think part of the infrastructure piece is, the cheaper we can make infrastructure operations, or anything you need to do from the infrastructure, the quicker you can move, right? As you make things more and more cheap, it just, why not try it, right?
Yeah.
And so, today a lot of these processes are very manual, very heavyweight, they take forever. So there it's like, okay, if I know this is going to take 4 weeks to do, I'm going to spend more time thinking about, should I do it? And when really what I want to be doing is just constantly doing stuff and not having to worry about the underlying pieces of it. So I think that's where we come in to really help operations teams be able to say yes to those sorts of challenges, both from developers as well as from the CIO, CEO types.
So this this journey that we started talking about at the top of this interview, takes us through these different platforms you're developing, in the vSphere integration, and then technology, and then the Photon platform, and this leads into like a lot of questions about the cultural change and open source and agility and DevOps, so to speak. Where's the journey going from here?
Well, I think it's going to be a long journey, right? I mean, if we even look at virtualization, it took a long time to really get that to a point of critical mass where it kind of became the default, right? We're seeing a lot of companies, and pretty much most all companies now have a virtualization first policy. Right. But that took a long time, and even still some security folks are still trying to wrap their heads around it, right? Which is like, dude. So I think we're going to see the same process here. Now, what we are seeing is, of course, a lot of excitement and tremendous uptake on the development community side. And the question is how quickly will that spill over into production and to really updating those operational constructs for containers and cloud native apps and so forth. My feeling is it will happen pretty quickly, but it's still going to be measured on the order of years. Many years in many cases.
And that's because then the whole issues around networking, for example.
Or storage, or any of these things. How do you handle storage persistence? And do you back it up, and how does that work, and so on and so forth. Absolutely. So I think there is a tremendous speed here to the pace, though. I will say that things are moving very, very rapidly. We're seeing a lot of startups getting into the ecosystem, a lot of innovation happening. And we talk, and different customers are going to go at different speeds, right? We see some customers who are all over this, who already have containerized apps in production. They want help. Right now it's kind of not optimal what they're doing, but they're making it work. They want help with it. But we also talked to other customers who are like, you know what, it's going to be like 3 years before I get there at all. And we're like, well, hopefully you can move a little bit faster. But just because of competitive, I mean, this is the thing. It goes back to the competitive pressures. I'm like, guys, someone else is going to come along who gets this stuff and gets it faster. And that's a big problem for you guys.
But the containers have been a symbolic.
Yes.
Have been very symbolic for companies,
All
haven't
this.
they?
Yeah.
Because they can now see something that they can relate to very easily.
Yep. I definitely think there's kind of containers are becoming kind of the rallying cry to some degree for all of this. Like, oftentimes when you talk about containers, what starts slipping in are things like microservice architectures and continuous integration and DevOps. People have this notion, I mean, yeah, if you do it properly, all that stuff comes together. But, you know, we actually have a number of customers who are looking at just tossing in their traditional applications into a container, not necessarily reinventing the architecture immediately, but looking at getting some of the basic benefits of containers, which is you know, much quicker time to reprovision, optimizing and simplifying the continuous integration pipeline. You know, these sorts of benefits, right? They can accrue now, even without the re-architecture. So you know, and I think to my earlier point as well, one of the great things about Docker is it's really the foundation for a very thriving ecosystem in the space, something that wasn't there before.
Right.
And now they have this kind of common technology that everyone can build off of. So I think that's a huge win for us as an industry and for businesses.
Well, hats off to you guys for embracing this new, you know, this new world and everything else, and you know, and really, you know, putting some charge into the ecosystem with what you're doing. I just want to conclude. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say, just as we finish up this interview.
Well, I think we covered most of the big announcements, you know, vSphere integrated containers and Photon platform. I think, you know, the key thing for us to stress is that, you know, we're really excited about engaging in the open source community, you know, both via things that we're contributing to that, as well as contributing back to other existing projects. And so, you know, really excited about 2016 as well. We got a number of projects that we're working on that will be opening up, kicking off throughout the year. So we're excited to continue engaging with the community as well as with customers on this very exciting journey.
That continuous story.
Yes.
That continuous feedback loop.
Exactly.
Great. Well, Kit, thank you very much for taking the time.
Cool. Thank you so much, Alex.